Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our remote O'Connor Conference on the occasion of the March for Life this year. We very much regret that we have to meet remotely, but we welcome you nonetheless warmly and heartily to our conference. And we want to express to you our sincere and heartfelt support for your own support for the great cause for human life. And we honor you for the inconvenience that it is taking for you to come, especially this year as COVID is raging, to march in person in the Capitol for this great cause. Now, I am Father Stephen Fields. I am a Jesuit priest who is a professor of philosophy and theology here at Georgetown University. And I would like to speak to you briefly on the subject of why the Catholic Church views abortion as what we would call an intrinsically evil act. And I do that here at Georgetown in the vicarious company of our founder. Georgetown, as you may know, is the oldest Catholic university in the United States. It was founded in the same year that the Constitution of our country was signed, that is 1789, and it was founded by John Karl, who was a great patriot, as well as the first bishop in the United States, and he himself had been a Jesuit before he became a bishop. So we have a great tradition here, and both American and Catholic. And so let me, without further ado, then speak to you on the subject of why the Catholic Church views abortion as an intrinsically evil act. And let me define that a mouthful of a term right at the outset. An intrinsically evil act means that some act or moral deed is considered wrong or evil by its very nature, and then as a result of its being evil by its very nature, it is never to be done under any circumstances for whatever reason. Now, this may surprise you, but I'm going to say that the Catholic Church, in the first instance, is not guided in its understanding of abortion as an intrinsically evil act on the basis of our Christian faith. It is guided, of course, our Christian faith supports this teaching, but first and foremost, the Catholic Church recognizes that right-thinking reason, human reason alone, can come to a sound and certain understanding that abortion is an intrinsically evil act. And so the Church is, if you will, not grounding, first and foremost, its understanding of the evil of abortion in Christian faith, although, as I say, and it's important to repeat, Christian faith buttresses, supports, and encourages what reason tells us, because after all, our Christian faith teaches us that every human being is made in the image and likeness of God. But reason itself can show us that abortion is wrong to do under any circumstances and for whatever reason. Now, The system of ethics, the system of morality that the church follows in this regard is called the natural law. And the natural law is nothing more than a system of ethics based on reasons, careful and sustained reflection on what human nature is and on the purposes and goals of human nature. And from this reflection on human nature, an understanding that reason develops emerges of what is good and bad and what is right and wrong to do. And this understanding of what is good and bad and right and wrong is congenial to our very nature as human beings. So we might say that the church respects the integrity of human reason and human thinking without the necessity of having any faith or making an act of faith to demonstrate that abortion is not to be done. Now, some people, of course, can be mistaken in the way they reason about right and wrong. So the natural law states that there is such a state of reason that we call right reason. And right reason is opposed to mistaken reason. In other words, right reason emerges when our human reason thinks consistently, coherently, and honestly about who we are as human beings and what we are, and about our goals and our purpose and our destiny precisely as human beings. Now, of course, none of us is unfamiliar with what right reason is. After all, the whole purpose of education is to inculcate in us, develop in us, how to think rightly about a whole range of subjects. We go into a classroom. We are taught by teachers. We take notes. We memorize. We do experiments in biology and chemistry. We read textbooks. We take examinations. We receive a grade. And what is the purpose of the final grade in every course we take? It is nothing more than to demonstrate whether we are able to think rightly about, say, biology or physics or history or literature, or to write the English language well and coherently according to its intrinsic rules. And if we get a low grade, well, we haven't thought rightly about the subject and we need to correct ourselves. So too, the natural law is simply a system of ethics that says there is a right way, a correct way to think about right and wrong. And that thinking is based on the right thinking about the nature of the human person and the goals and purposes of the human person. Now, you will run into, or probably have run into in your education, many systems of ethics. Now, the system of the natural law has a long tradition in our Western culture. It begins really with Socrates in the 4th century before Christ, in the golden age of Greece. Socrates, of course, is the discoverer of the very nature of right thinking in our Western society. That is the purpose of all of his great dialogues. But it has a long tradition of being developed beyond Socrates in, for instance, Roman thinkers, such as Cicero and the Roman legal thinkers in the 5th, 4th, 3rd centuries. And it was brought, the theory of the natural law was brought to a high point by St. Thomas Aquinas, the great doctor, saint of the church in the 13th century. And it continues to be developed even today by creative thinkers such as Robert George at Princeton and the late Germain Grisey, who recently died, who was professor here at Georgetown and then at Mount St. Mary's Seminary, and John Finnis, who was a professor at Notre Dame and Oxford. Now, a basic and fundamental norm, rule, or regulation of the natural law is this. And unless we understand this, we can't really grasp what the natural law means and how the natural law applies to the immorality of abortion. This premise is the following: evil may never be done, even to bring about a good purpose. Let me repeat that. Evil may never be done, even to bring about a good purpose. Now, there are other systems of ethics that compete with the natural law and disagree with the natural law, and will dispute this first premise. So let us take a moment to understand how important this first premise is. What it is saying is that a good end, a good purpose, a good result never justifies a means that is wrong. Now, some people would say, well, if we lie, for instance, to save to prevent evil consequences, it is perfectly legitimate to lie. But lying is also considered an intrinsically evil act and should not be done for whatever the purpose is. Now, we have to define very carefully what a lie is, and we have to discriminate between lying and, say, equivocation or carefully phrasing what we might say to people. But a lie, outright lie, is not considered a good act. It's considered intrinsically evil. So we might consider this for a moment. Socrates, for instance, has told us that when someone does an evil act, it is not in the first instance the harm that is done to the people who feel that evil that is the real problem. The real problem is that when we do evil, we corrode our very essence as a human person. This is because, Socrates tells us in his famous dialogue called the Crito, this is because the human person, constituted by a spiritual dimension or a soul, corrodes the soul by doing something that is evil. And therefore, the very spiritual essence and integrity of the human person is undermined when evil is done. And doing evil then to ourselves by doing evil to others is the first great problem with doing evil. And so evil should never be done, even for a good result. Now, as I said, this rule that evil may never be done stands at odds with other views of ethics and morality, and the first system that is at odds with it is called utilitarianism. Now, utilitarianism argues that what is good is determined by what produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Now, following that standard, of course, any number of things that we would consider evil could in fact be done and considered to be good. By this system, for instance, the mass murders of the Nazis during the Second World War, particularly with regard to the Jews, could be legitimated and justified. So could the other mass murders and acts of genocide that we have witnessed in the 20th century. And we think particularly of the mass murders in Cambodia in the 1970s under a Marxist named Pol Pot. We also think of the mass murders in the Balkan states in the 1990s to root out Muslims, for instance. So some will argue, in fact, that abortion can be legitimated and justified by utilitarian thinking. In other words, some utilitarians will argue that I can and perhaps even should take innocent human life because it brings about some good either for me or for society as a whole. And we hear this argument constantly. But I want to make it clear that the system of the natural law, which the church supports, but which in and of itself is first and foremost a system of right reason and does not need faith to legitimate, takes issue with this because the system of the natural law is grounded on the following premise: that evil may never be done, even to produce a greater good, either for myself or for society or for both. And the reason that evil may never be done, even to produce a good result, is that evil is a corrosion, first and foremost, of the very spiritual essence and integrity of every human person who does it. It is a wound at the very heart of the essence of every person who commits an evil. Now, let us turn to the next question, and that is, why is abortion an act that is, according to the natural law, an intrinsically evil act, and so may never be done, even to produce a good end, either for me or for society or for both? Well, the answer to that question is as follows. The natural law thinking through this matter of what abortion is what we call the direct taking of innocent human life. It is the direct taking of human life. And as a result, it is fundamentally wrong, intrinsically evil, and cannot be done under any circumstances for any reason. Now, let me explain the key terms in the answer, which is that abortion is the direct taking of innocent human life. Let's consider each of these terms. First of all, why is the fetus human life? Well, the fetus is equipped from conception, as science tells us, with the genetic and chromosomal material that defines the species humanity. Therefore, what we see is that human life constitutes a continuum from conception to death. There is no point in this continuum where it makes sense to draw an arbitrary line and to say that at such and so a point, the fetus or the embryo is not a part of the human species. But now, some will say, well, the fetus is a human life. Yes, it belongs to the human species, but it is not a human person. And therefore, since it is not a human person, it is subject to abortion. Now, this claim that the fetus is human life but not a person makes absolutely no sense to me, and I'll tell you why. A human life is necessarily and by definition personal. What makes a human person? What makes a human person are the capacities of intelligence and will, that is, the power of reasoning, self-conscious reasoning, and the power of self-determination, which we derive from our capacity to choose freely. So we could claim, certainly, that a 2-year-old is only crudely a person compared to a 12-year-old, but nonetheless still has the power and capacity of what is intrinsic to a human person, and that is intelligence and free will. So too, we could say that a 12-year-old is only crudely a person when compared to a 50-year-old. But nonetheless, a 12-year-old still has the capacity of intelligence and will in a superior way to a 2-year-old, even as a 2-year-old has the capacity of intelligence and will in a superior way to a newborn baby. But nonetheless, the baby still has the capacity of intelligence and will. So even though we exercise intelligence and will crudely compared to our more advanced developed stages, no one is going to argue that it is legitimate to murder a 2-year-old or a 12-year-old or a newborn baby. So therefore, the only consistent argument is to say that intelligence and willpower, which constitute a human person, develop and grow and mature sequentially throughout human life. and human life begins with conception, which therefore means that human personhood begins in a crude way, of course, in a less developed way, with conception, and that from conception, through birth, through growing to be 2, through growing to be 12, through growing to be 50, intelligence and will develop and mature. Therefore, sheer logic, sheer consistent thinking, as the natural law encourages us to think, shows us that if there is human life, there is personhood. Now, let us ask the second question. Why is the fetus innocent human life? Well, the answer to that is simply that the fetus has done nothing that merits injustice, any harm. It is not, the fetus is not, for instance, a criminal convicted by the state and therefore worthy of some just punishment. The fetus is not a soldier who is fighting in a war and is therefore liable to harm. Some have said, for instance, I have heard the argument that some have said the fetus is an aggressor against its mother, and therefore, because it is endangering the mother's mental or physical health or well-being, it therefore is an aggressor, and as an aggressor, it is just to take its life and therefore halt its aggression. This, again, is utterly specious reasoning and makes absolutely no sense according to the criteria of the natural law, which is to think rightly and clearly about right and wrong. Why? Because in being an aggressor against its mother, the fetus has absolutely no moral agency. In other words, it is certainly not exercising any free choice by which we can call rightly its activity that may be harming the mental or physical health of the mother an act of aggression. Quite the contrary. It is the mother who has moral agency, that is, who has free will, in deciding in the first place to conceive and beget the child that is within her. So therefore, the only conclusion is that not only is the fetus in no way considered an aggressor, but in fact innocent, but as a result of being innocent, the fetus not only deserves no punishment, but it deserves injustice, quite the contrary. It deserves protection and nurturing by those who do have moral agency. And we begin in the first place with its mother. Now, let us come to the third question. Why is abortion called the direct taking of innocent human life? The direct taking or the direct doing of any act, moral act, means that a person consciously and deliberately intends to do that act. The person, in other words, doesn't do something wrong by accident. Well, when, for instance, we may be involved in an automobile accident and someone is harmed or injured, If we were obeying the speed limit and skidded on some hard-to-see oil on the highway, then we would be judged far less strictly than if we had been driving while under the influence of alcohol. So in the first instance, when we skidded, we would have harmed an innocent person indirectly, that is, without our direct intention to do so. We would not have consciously and deliberately chosen to do it, nor would we have done anything wrong within our reasonable power to bring about the injury. But in the second instance, we would be more directly responsible for harming an innocent person because we had done something wrong. For example, we had been drinking by our free intent, and we had chosen to drive a car by our free intent. And those actions, which we deliberately chose, led to the injury. So abortion then is the directly intended taking of an innocent human life. It does not happen by accident. It happens by the deliberately chosen intention of the person who is doing it and who has chosen to have it done. So let us then summarize what we have said. The Catholic Church recognizes the power of human reason, even without having made any kind of act of religious or Christian faith. But the Catholic Church recognizes the power of human reason to think clearly, rightly, and consistently about what is good and what is wrong, what should be done and what should not be done. And that system, by which reason thinks clearly about what should be done and should not be done, what is good and what is evil, is called the natural law. The natural law simply reflects on what is good for a human being to do. And the fundamental premise of the natural law, which goes back in the history of the West, not to Christ, first and foremost, but 300 years before Christ, to Socrates in the golden age of Greece, where Socrates tells us that to do evil is to corrode the very spiritual integrity and essence of what it means to be a human being. So therefore, why, if evil is never to be done under any circumstances, is abortion considered an evil act that should never be done under any circumstances and for any reason? The answer is that abortion is the directly intended taking of innocent human life. The direct taking of innocent human life is morally wrong and should never be done. The embryo and the fetus are not just human life, but they are and must be considered personal human life, because from the moment of conception, human life entails the capacity of human beings, which is intelligence and free will. So I hope, ladies and gentlemen, that this expose, this brief though it was, has been of assistance to you. And I wish you well and I applaud your courage for all that you are doing, both here at the March for Life and back in your hometowns for the great and noble cause of life.